أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في يونيو الماضي كانت المناظرة بين الرئيس الحالي جو بايدن والمرشح دونالد ترامب كارثية بالنسبة لبايدن، فأنهت حملته الانتخابية. أما في سبتمبر فقد أوشكت المناظرة بين كاميلا هاريس ودونالد ترامب على أن تكون كارثية بالنسبة لترامب، لكنها من المؤكد لم تنهي حملته الانتخابية. هذه المناظرة كشفت عن نقاط ضعف خطيرة، وأكدت أن هاريس نائب الرئيس الحالي هي منافس مؤهل للوصول إلى البيت الأبيض. ما الذي اكتشفناه في هذه المناظرة؟ وما هو تأثير هذا الحدث على الولايات القليلة التي ستحدد الفائز في انتخاباتنا؟ لمناقشة أصداء المناظرة الرئاسية يسعدني أن أرحب بالنخبة من الخبراء السياسيين البارزين بيانكا فاشيني وجيم أنتل ونورمان أورنستين. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, they met in their first and perhaps only debate of this presidential election. Let's take a look at what happened with Bianca Fashini and Norman Ornstein. Great to have you both with us. So in broad terms, this debate didn't turn out quite as well for Donald Trump as did his June debate against Joe Biden. Norm, what's the big picture here?
So we have to first have the caveat, Rob, that debates do matter to some significant degree. We've seen that happen before. I think there's little doubt that the public perception that Richard Nixon lost his first debate with John F. Kennedy could have made all the difference in a very close election. But we've still got 50 plus days to go, and a lot of other things will happen. What made this debate significant is two things. The first is it introduced Kamala Harris to a large number of people who didn't know much about her, even though she's been vice president for almost 4 years. And frankly, it's partly because she's been vice president. Vice presidents kind of fade into the woodwork. And she made a positive impression overall, I think. The second is that it showed some of the deep weaknesses of Donald Trump by almost every standard, including many of those who are supporters of his, not his own team. He lost. And he basically went unhinged during this debate. I will tell you this, Rob, that when Joe Biden debated Donald Trump, 30 seconds in, most of us knew that this was going to be a rough night for Joe Biden. The way he walked in, the level of confusion on his face, the sagging features. With this debate, 30 seconds in, it was pretty clear that Donald Trump was in deep trouble. Why? Kamala Harris strode in, went over into his space, put out her hand, making it impossible for him not to shake it, and basically sending a signal. I'm the alpha one here. And when you move from that to 3 minutes in, when she ridiculed his crowd sizes, which set him off for the remainder of the debate, you knew that he was not going to do well. But we got a lot of time to go and a lot more things to happen.
So, Bianca, one would have imagined that Harris would have been the focus of the evening. After all, as Norm just said, she's the one who needed to introduce herself to the country. She was not very well known after 3.5 years as vice president. But it was Trump who was the focus, and he was on the defensive throughout. How was she able to turn the tables, making Trump the focus on her battleground?
Well, I think as you just heard Norm mention, she baited him by mentioning his crowd sizes at his rallies. And it was all downhill from there because it's been well reported that's something that former President Trump cares deeply about and mentions a lot. And I think the big takeaway is, yes, Vice President Kamala Harris did have to make an effort in this debate to define herself. We've heard a lot of people in Washington say that, because it is true that most Americans, of course, they care about the vice president, but it's really the president that is the star of the show. And before she became vice president, she wasn't a very well-known figure in Washington for a long time. And this was, I think, her effort and her campaign's effort to make it seem like she's a fighter. So I think the big takeaway is definitely that the Harris campaign is very happy with how she performed. The Trump campaign is maybe not as thrilled. I do think that there was a real effort from ABC to ask both candidates about a lot of different topics. But ultimately, what everyone's talking about is this claim that Haitian immigrants are stealing household pets, killing them, and eating them. That's been the story for the past couple days, up until, of course, the second alleged assassination attempt against former President Trump. So I'm interested to see what will happen in the vice presidential debate. That's next month. Obviously not as important as the presidential debate, but because Senator J.D. Vance, who is Trump's running mate, is an Ohio senator and has really leaned into that story and made it what it was, it will be interesting to see how that one goes and what comes of that.
All right. So lots of issues raised in your remarks. I'm delighted to welcome Jim Antle to the show. Glad to have you, Jim. We're going to dive right in. Bianca just referred to ABC News. The moderators played an interesting, somewhat different role in this debate than the previous debate. What was that? And is everybody happy with how they played it?
Well, there was a certain amount of criticism of how CNN handled the first debate and their choice not really to fact check the candidates in real time. And some people, mainly Democrats, thought that that let former President Trump make a lot of outlandish claims and kind of advantaged him unfairly in that first debate. So this debate with ABC News, they took a different tack, and they did fact check the candidates in real time. And of course, naturally, that made another set of people unhappy and make allegations that the handling of the debate was unfair. In this case, mainly Republicans who argued that it was Trump who was fact-checked disproportionately and not Vice President Harris. Obviously, a lot of defenders of how the network handled it would say that that's disproportionate because of the disproportion and who needed to be fact-checked. But nevertheless, some people believe that that had an impact on the debate. It certainly altered, I think, Trump's handling of the debate in that it was one of two things: Harris's effectiveness at getting certain shots in, especially relative to Joe Biden, and also the fact that he had to have somewhat more contentious exchanges with the moderators themselves, I think contributed to his sort of beginning to lose his temper at various points in the debate. In the first debate, Trump came across largely as sort of calm and more measured in his deliveries, at least a quieter tone than what he tends to use at his rallies and on the campaign trail. He started out that way in the second debate, and as Harris began to get under his skin, and as he started to have some back and forths with the moderators, you started to hear him raise his voice a little bit. And where, infirmity was always the risk for Biden in any of these kinds of, public appearances, for Trump, the liability is always seeming unhinged, seeming a little intemperate. And that was part of the takeaway, I think, of that second debate and why it didn't go as well for him as the first did.
So debates, if they have lasting impact, are because, in many respects, because of certain moments that one remembers. You referred a moment ago, Norm, to the handshake. Substantively, there were a handful of moments, I think, during this debate that will resonate for quite a period of time. Let's talk about a few of these. First, on domestic politics, Donald Trump was asked about his oft-repeated goal of getting rid of the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare. He's run for president now 3 times, was president for 4 years. He was asked if he had a plan of his own to substitute for Obamacare. What was his reply?
Well, of course, he said, I've got concepts. That was after being pushed by the moderators. We now have an ad out that shows him over basically a 9-year period, saying, we've got a wonderful plan. We'll have it in 2 weeks. No, the plan's almost ready. It's going to be out there. This was done over this entire period of time. And now he was forced to basically say, I still don't have a plan, but I've got concepts. That one did, I think, resonate and click with a significant number of people. The eating the pets is one that I know we saw from focus groups. And I think I don't put a lot of trust in focus groups watching debates, but I think a lot of people watching thought that was a pretty bizarre moment. And then the other was the way he handled and the way she handled the Dobbs decision, Roe v. Wade, and the abortion decision, which probably for her was substantively her strongest moment, because we're looking at a battle for a relatively small number of persuadable voters, swing voters, a lot of them suburban women. And on that one, I don't think Trump helped himself very much.
So there are, for our viewers who are, of course, in the Middle East, there were a couple of very interesting foreign policy moments that I think people will remember. Bianca, at one point, Trump was asked not once but twice if he wanted Ukraine to win the war in Russia, against Russia. Now, Ukraine, of course, is the recipient of hundreds of billions of dollars of American assistance and American support and weaponry. How did the former president reply to this?
Not really with a direct answer, I guess. I think one thing, though, about foreign policy in American presidential elections, though, that's a really important point to bring up, is that it rarely decides who voters are going to pick. I would say, of course, there are exceptions, right? Like post 9/11, I think elections maybe held a different, or foreign policy held a different weight to voters. But Ukraine is not something that I think the average voter, certainly not a swing state voter or someone that is undecided and is looking at both candidates, no one's going to say, one of their stances on Ukraine and Russia is what led me to vote for them or to not vote for them. And I think that's just simply sort of explains former President Trump's approach to not only Ukraine, but, a lot of other of his, foreign policy stances that he has, sort of changed over the past 4 to 8 years.
I think you're absolutely right. Your point about voters here not voting on foreign policy is well documented. But there were a couple of interesting moments, Jim, when Kamala Harris went on the attack by ridiculing, in her view, Donald Trump, noting that she said that foreign leaders laugh at you. Trump named a foreign leader that doesn't laugh at him. It was a bit of an odd choice, I think, for most Americans. Who was that?
Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, was, I believe, his first choice of somebody to invoke in his defense, which, certainly does animate a certain corner of the right, but I don't know that a very familiar figure to most Americans. I think ridicule is an effective tool to use against Trump. He doesn't like to be made fun of. He doesn't like to be portrayed as weak or ineffective or not respected on the international stage. His contribution to international prestige is a core argument that he's trying to make and has been trying to make over the last 9 years. He's been, in national politics, that he'd make the United States more respected on the world stage again. So at the same time, I do think there is a risk in some of Harris's strategy in that it is sort of more aimed at really hardcore partisans and trying to sort of avenge Joe Biden's loss in the first debate, which, I think is appealing certainly to Democratic base voters. And there's a certain amount of her appeal and her improvement of the Democrats' position in this race that stems, quite frankly, from ginning up a lot more enthusiasm among Democrats who really felt doomed. But there is sort of the question is, of the very small number of undecideds, are they kind of looking for somebody who's skilled at taunting Trump, or are there certain questions about public policy and how to improve their lives that they want answered?
Okay, when we come back after the break, we're going to pick up just there to ask whether there are specific items in the debate that would appeal to those marginal voters in the half a dozen key states that will determine the outcome of the vote. Our guests again today include Bianca Fascinet. Bianca is a political correspondent for The Hill. Previously, she was a national correspondent for Scripps News Washington Bureau, where she covers politics and the economy. Also with us is Norman Ornstein. Norm is Emeritus Scholar at the American Enterprise Institute and one of America's wisest experts on politics, Congress, and the presidency. And a guest today is W. James Antle III. He is the executive editor of the Washington Examiner magazine. Previously, Jim was politics editor at the Examiner, managing editor of the online Daily Caller, associate editor of the American Spectator, and senior writer for the American Conservative. So as we have said throughout many months now, this entire election, 100 million voters are really going to come down just to a handful of states and just a few thousand voters in each of those states. Now, when you look at what happened in the debate between Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, was there anything special that stood out to you that might affect those key voters in just those handful of states that will determine the outcome? Let's start with you, Jim.
Well, I think Harris has done a much better job than Biden at trying to make her campaign about the economy and acknowledging that people are not happy with the state of the economy, even if there are a number of aggregate economic statistics the administration could cite to try to argue that the public perceptions are wrong or sort of disproportionately negative. I think Biden was more defensive about the state of the economy. I think he also trusted too much advisors who thought that the election could be about democracy and January 6th, and that just wasn't really showing up in either the public or a lot of the Democratic private polling. I think Harris has tried a bit more to say, I'm the middle class kid. I had a middle class upbringing. I understand that people are hurting. Whether they heard a lot of solutions, at least in the debate, I know she's laid out some policy papers and given some speeches about this. But in the debate itself, I'm not quite as sure of that. But there was, sometimes sort of contrasting imagery, middle class upbringing. Donald Trump obviously did not have a middle class upbringing. Those things can speak to some voters.
Bianca, does some moment that you think might have an impact on these key voters in the few states that matter?
Well, one thing that I think is interesting is that both candidates have offered some sort of childcare affordability solution, which is really, for the first time in my lifetime, I've actually seen childcare affordability talked about as an issue. It's not being made as a top priority. I think it's part of both of their different economic plans. But when I think about undecided voters that are millennials and Gen Z, people like me, I have one son, and the thought of having another child and having to pay for childcare for that child is enough to make me pass out. It's really expensive, and it's something that the average American cannot comfortably afford. So I do think that if either of those candidates really lean into the tax credits and whatever else they might come out with in terms of really making a long-term solution to the very real crisis in childcare affordability, that is something that could sway younger voters. Obviously not voters that are older and maybe past the point in their life of having kids, but for their kids, if they know that, they want grandkids, but their own kids feel like they can't afford it, it's something that could maybe lean people towards one candidate or the other.
So, Norm, Joe Biden had been soft in his support among young people, and even to a certain extent, a little weak in the support that he had from another core Democratic constituency, which is African Americans. Has Kamala Harris erased that softness and remedied this problem?
She's made great strides, Rob, but it's not entirely clear that we're going to have the completely enthusiastic Democratic base. Young voters go overwhelmingly at this point for Democrats, but the question is whether they're going to turn out. And young voters of color are still a weakness for her. Let me mention a couple of things. One issue that did not come up in the debate that I think will be an important one for swing voters, that's guns. This debate occurred right after another horrific school shooting in which young children and teachers were killed. The vice presidential running mate of Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, who in the debate, Trump said, well, I don't really know what his positions are and they're not mine anyhow. But he said that school shootings are a fact of life as he moved to oppose any change in the gun laws, including background checks or waiting periods. I think for a lot of those suburban voters, the swing voters who have kids in school or grandkids in school, the idea that they're going to have to spend their lives worrying every morning as they go to school whether they're going to be able to come back home, I think that will resonate. I'd mentioned before abortion, the Dobbs decision. That's one where you can see both Trump and Republican candidates all around the country now trying to distance themselves from some of the more extreme positions that have been taken in some of these states. And I think that's a fact of life that they now see that they're on the wrong side in terms of winning more support. So that's an issue that I think will be a particularly important one. And, you know, let me just return to Trump, the border issue, which is the one issue, no matter what the question was, Trump kept talking about the border. He is focused, obsessed with the border. But saying as he did that he intends to deport 15 million or more Americans is perhaps not going to be helpful to him with some of those swing Hispanic voters who have been leaning Republican because they're more conservative on social issues. And also, for a lot of them, they don't care as much about people here who are undocumented when they came here legally. There are 400 to 500,000 Haitian Americans in South Florida. And the idea that you're condemning the Haitian community as eating people's pets and blowing up a city in Ohio may not rest well with them. And that could make a difference in the election as well. I think we're going to see some of these issues play out, perhaps not in the way that Donald Trump and his running mate have anticipated.
So we mentioned earlier, you just mentioned the running mate. So we do have at least one debate more in this presidential election campaign. And that is definitely between J.D. Vance and Tim Walz. Jim, what do you expect when these running mates, two Midwestern politicians, get together on the debate stage?
I expect a fair amount of fireworks because, by all appearances, they don't like each other very much. So, you know, that in and of itself, I think, could set things up to be pretty contentious.
All right. On that note, I'm going to say thank you to you, Norm, Jim, Bianca. Thank you for helping explain the significance of what might be the only presidential debate between our two candidates in this election cycle. Thank you for joining me on داخل واشنطن. وصلنا إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة وخاصة حول دور وسائل الإعلام في حملتنا الانتخابية الرئاسية، أرجو تواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو مباشرة على @RobSatloff. أراكم في الأسبوع المقبل وحتى ذلك الحين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.